Hello, my name is Phil Roudebush. I'm an Extension Master Gardener volunteer in Buncombe County. Today I'd like to give you a few tips on creating deer-resistant landscapes. This is an outline of what we're going to cover today. First of all, we'll talk about nuisance wildlife resources that are available to you beyond this presentation, where you can find resources that deal with not only deer but other nuisance wildlife. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about integrated pest management, or IPM, and talk about general management strategies that fall under the IPM category. Then we'll talk about deer themselves and some general strategies for deer management, and then finally focus on landscape choices that you can make that will hopefully decrease damage that might occur in your gardens or landscape. So nuisance wildlife resources, the first place to really look related to North Carolina is the North Carolina Extension Gardener Handbook. This is available to purchase as a hardcover book, or each of the chapters can be found on the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service website. There is a chapter in the handbook on wildlife, not only encouraging wildlife to come to your yard, but also talking about dealing with nuisance wildlife. So you can download that chapter, and that's a good place to begin. The second resource that's really excellent for North Carolina is the website maintained by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. It's pretty easy to remember. It's just wildlife.org. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about resources that are available there. And then finally, the University of Florida Cooperative Extension Service has some excellent monographs that talk about dealing with wildlife. They have one monograph on how to identify the wildlife species responsible for damage in your yard. They also have one on how to modify habitat to discourage nuisance wildlife. And they also have an excellent one on coping with deer damage. These are all available through the Florida Extension website. The address is listed here, or you can just search on Florida Extension Nuisance Wildlife and find these monographs. As I said, ncwildlife.org is a very good place to find some resources that deal with wildlife. And they have a section called Have a Wildlife Problem. Under that, they have a section on injured or orphaned wildlife, how to deal with those. Another section on preventing wildlife conflicts. And then finally, they have an excellent section where they have information about a variety of different individual wildlife species. That includes a range map for the species, an overview. If you have a problem with that wildlife species, what problems might you expect? And then finally, some management alternatives that not only talk about trapping, relocation, and hunting, but other information about dealing with nuisance wildlife. And I would encourage you to check out that website. Let's talk about integrated pest management, or strategies. A pest is defined as any unwanted living organism. We typically think about viruses, bacteria, fungi, and especially insects as pests. But deer and other nuisance wildlife also meet the definition of a pest. So we're going to talk a little bit about IPM and how it relates to deer management. I like to think of IPM as a pyramid, and what we would like to do is begin by focusing on those things at the bottom of the pyramid. What can we do culturally in our gardens and landscape to help prevent deer damage? And that's what we're going to focus on today. When we move up the pyramid, there are certainly some mechanical and physical things we can do to help manage pests. Then a little bit higher are biological control measures, and finally at the top, chemical control measures. Examples of that for deer would be repellent, or certainly there sometimes can be some lethal alternatives as well. So let's talk a little bit about the nuisance wildlife that we're focusing on today, and that's the deer, and more specifically the white-tailed deer. It's categorized as a browsing keystone herbivore. By browsing, we mean that it feeds on leaves, twigs, soft shoots, and fruits of both woody and herbaceous plants, in contrast to grazing animals that eat grass or other lower vegetation. They're also considered to be a keystone species. This means that through their feeding behavior and through their high populations, they have the ability to shift the composition and structure of entire plant communities. The other important thing to remember about deer is that they cause year-round damage. We have a tendency to think about protecting our landscapes during the active growing season from March through October. But again, deer do not hibernate in the wintertime. They need a food source, and so much of the damage they cause will actually be in the winter season. As we know, deer populations are quite high today. It's estimated that there are over 30 million white-tailed deer in the United States, and they've really rebounded when they were less than 500,000 in the late 19th century. It's also important to think about deer anatomy. This is the skull of a deer, where you can see that it has incisor teeth on the lower jaw or mandible, and this means that when they browse, they have a tendency to tear plant tissue rather than incising it sharply. In the picture in the upper right, you're going to see damage from deer that has browsed on twigs or shoots of a tree. And again, you can see the very rough nature of the damage, and that is in sharp contrast to what you'll see with rodents, such as rabbits or voles, where they'll have a very sharp incision in the plant tissue. They usually will browse from about 6 to 70 inches above the ground, although you can see in the lower pictures that some deer can browse higher than that in certain trees. In the gardens and landscape, they can cause considerable damage, not only to trees and shrubs, but also to flowering plants in the garden. Examples here are sweet corn damage and damage to chard. So what are some overall deer management strategies? Well, we're going to focus today on planting deer-resistant plants in the landscape. And here's one example. We'll talk about several others here in just a minute. A Russian sage on the left is very resistant to damage from deer, whereas hostas on the right are frequently damaged severely by deer browsing. So certainly planting more resistant plants in the landscape is the base of our IPM strategy. We move up the IPM pyramid. The next are mechanical or physical control mechanisms, and certainly fencing is what we most commonly use for deer management. If you're using a single fence, because deer can leap quite high, it probably needs to be at least 8 feet in height. However, there are other fencing strategies that can be much lower and less obtrusive, and you can actually use twisted nylon rope to establish 2 levels of fencing that will inhibit deer. There is a company called Deer Fence that has a good website. They primarily sell materials to commercial companies, but they have some good ideas for different type of fencing that can be used for deer. Again, on the pyramid, the second level is not only mechanical and physical barriers. You can use some scare tactics. There are motion controlled water sprays, motion controlled strobe lights that can sometimes be a deer deterrent. The next level up on the IPM pyramid is biological control, and probably the best example of biological control would be to have domestic dogs around your property. As an example, my daughter and her family in Asheville have 2 miniature schnauzers. They spend lots of time in a fenced backyard, and there is a large herd of deer that come through the neighborhood every day, but they really don't touch anything in the yard because of the presence of the dogs. Last summer, they went on vacation for a couple of weeks, took the dogs with them in the middle of the summer, and in the 2 weeks they were gone, the deer came in and completely decimated the hostas, which were outside the fence in the yard. So it just shows that dogs, or the presence of dogs, can sometimes be a biological deterrent for deer. At the top of the pyramid there is chemical control, and probably the best example of chemical control are various deer repellent products. If you're interested in repellents, there is a separate educational video that does talk specifically about repellents, the types of repellents, and how they can be used. And finally, certainly lethal efforts or hunting can be done with deer, and there is quite a bit of information on ncwildlife.org about hunting strategies and regulations for deer. What we're going to do today is really focus on using deer-resistant plants in your garden or landscape. I think the best resource for this is this bulletin from Rutgers Extension. It's Bulletin E271. It's titled Landscape Plants Rated by Deer Resistance. It You can easily find this, and there should be a PDF of this bulletin attached to this presentation. What they have done is they have rated over 450 different plants by how resistant they are to damage from deer. They have 4 categories for each of the plants: plants that are rarely damaged, plants that are seldom damaged, and then plants that are occasionally severely damaged, and then frequently severely damaged. Of course, the success of any of these plants will really depend on the local deer populations, will depend on weather conditions and the time of year. Those plants that are in the occasional and frequently severely damaged categories are preferred by deer, and they should only be planted with additional protections such as the use of fencing or repellents. We can't go through the entire list, but what I've done is taken each of the categories, and I'll give you some example of plants that are found in each of the categories in this bulletin. These are what I call deer-wise examples or deer-unwise examples. In the first category we'll talk about are flowers, and again, this is information taken directly from the bulletin. So examples of flowering plants that are rarely damaged include snapdragons. Those plants in the category that are seldom severely damaged by deer, including lantana, and then moving up to occasionally severely damaged, it shows here dahlias. It's important to remember that even though it's in a category that's rare, seldom, or occasional, that doesn't mean never. And again, depending on the deer population and the time of year, these flowering plants may still be damaged by deer. Second category listed in the bulletin are bulbs, and examples of bulbs that are rarely damaged, including the autumn crocus. This is a beautiful flower that usually blooms in September or October, and it's rarely fed upon by deer. Gladiolas are in the seldom damaged category, and at the other end of the spectrum are tulips, which are frequently severely damaged. Again, tulips have a tendency to be just like candy for deer, and deer can cause quite a bit of damage to tulips. In general, ferns and grasses are very resistant to damage by deer and are ones that can be often used in the landscape. Rarely damaged are most of our native and exotic ferns. Pictured here is one of my favorites, a cinnamon fern, but I have quite a few ferns in the beds around my house. Most of the ornamental grasses shown here is fountain grass. Most of the ornamental grasses are also rarely damaged by deer. Again, I have quite a few ornamental grasses and have never had problems with deer, even though we have deer in the neighborhood frequently. In the seldom damaged category are some grasses that are used more as ground covers. An example here is the dwarf mondo grass, and most ground covers are fairly resistant to damage from deer. There's a large list of perennial plants in the bulletin. We can't go through all of those, but here are some examples. Rarely damaged are many of the herbs that we use. This shows rosemary, and rosemary is very resistant to deer. I enjoy rhubarb, growing rhubarb in my garden, and rhubarb is seldom damaged from deer browsing. This may be because the rhubarb leaves contain calcium oxalate, which may inhibit browsing. In the occasional damage category are Shasta daisies, and as we mentioned earlier, deer love hostas, and they are frequently damaged. Again, in the perennials, if it's in the occasional or frequently damaged category, the recommendation is you're probably going to need to use some type of other deer management strategy in addition to these plants themselves. With regard to shrubs, here's some examples from the bulletin. Boxwoods are rarely damaged from browsing deer, and that's one reason they're very popular in the landscape. In the seldom category, an example is sweet shrub. Occasional damage are all the hydrangeas, and frequently damaged are azaleas and rhododendron. Again, both hydrangeas, azaleas, and rhododendron are all popular for use in the landscape. It's just important to remember that if you do have those, you probably need to use some type of other deer management strategy if you have a high or moderate deer pressure. And finally, trees are most often damaged when they're seedlings or saplings. They can also be browsed on as mature trees. But examples here, those that are rarely damaged include river birch. Seldom damaged include Japanese maple. Occasional damage, the sweet gum that's pictured here, all the oak trees can occasionally be damaged quite severely, especially when they're saplings. And then in the frequently damaged category are Arborvitae. So I've only been able to give you a small sampling of the different landscape plants rated by deer resistance. And I would encourage you to get the Rutgers Bulletin. Again, it contains over 450 different plants, and really use that as a resource as you plan a new landscape or as you plan to replace other plants in your landscape environment. If you have questions about deer management, deer resistant plants, or other gardening questions, please contact the Extension Master Gardener helpline at the phone number listed here. There'll be somebody there Monday, Wednesday, and Friday during the growing season from March through October. Another good way to submit questions and pictures of plants or plant diseases, the email address bunkummg@gmail.com. I hope this has given you a few ideas to think about deer management. Thanks for joining us, and happy gardening.